Captain Rebecca "Becky" Torres had been flying for 37 years, and every morning she still felt that familiar flutter of excitement as she walked through the terminal doors of Denver International Airport. At 59, she moved with the confident stride of someone who'd logged over 20,000 flight hours without a single incident. Her graying hair was pulled back in the same neat bun she'd worn since her Air Force days, and her uniform was pressed to perfection. "Morning, Captain Torres," called out Jake Williams, a baggage handler who'd known her for 15 years. She always remembered to ask about his daughter's soccer games. "Morning, Jake. How did Emma do in regionals?" "Scored 2 goals. "Thanks for asking, Captain." This was Rebecca's world, a place where respect was earned through decades of flawless service, where her reputation spoke louder than any corporate memo. She'd flown through hurricanes, ice storms, and mechanical failures that would have rattled younger pilots. Her passengers trusted her completely, and her crew knew they were in the safest hands possible. But as she approached the crew briefing room that Tuesday morning, Rebecca noticed something different in the atmosphere. Conversations stopped when she entered. Younger pilots glanced at her with what looked like pity. First Officer Marcus Peterson, barely 30 and fresh from flight school, was already seated at the conference table, scrolling through his tablet, with the casual arrogance of someone who believed technology could replace experience. "Good morning, everyone," Rebecca said, taking her usual seat at the head of the table. "Actually, Captain Torres," came a voice from the doorway. "Could I see you for a moment?" Rebecca turned to see Flight Operations Manager David Hartwell, approaching with a manila folder tucked under his arm. Hartwell was new to the company, a cost-cutting hire from a budget airline known for prioritizing profits over safety. He was the type of manager who looked at pilots as expensive overhead rather than skilled professionals. "Of course," Rebecca replied, though something in Hartwell's tone made her stomach tighten. They stepped into the hallway, and Hartwell's expression grew serious. "Rebecca, I'm going to be direct with you. There's been some discussion at the corporate level about our pilot demographics." "I'm sorry. What does that mean?" "Well, you're approaching 60, and there are concerns about whether our most senior pilots are keeping up with modern aviation technology. The new Airbus A350s we're bringing into the fleet next month have completely digital systems. Everything is computerized now." Rebecca felt a familiar fire building in her chest, the same feeling she'd had when male pilots in the 1980s suggested she couldn't handle a heavy aircraft. "David, I've successfully transitioned to every new aircraft type introduced in the past 20 years. My safety record is impeccable." "I'm not questioning your past performance," Hartwell said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "But this is about the future. We need pilots who can adapt quickly to new technology, who can think like computers, not like—" He paused, searching for the right words. "Like old-school pilots?" Rebecca finished coldly. "Like pilots who learned in a different era," he corrected. "Look, no decisions have been made yet, but I wanted to give you a heads up. Corporate is looking at early retirement packages for our senior staff. Very generous packages." The words hit Rebecca like turbulence at 30,000 feet. After 37 years of perfect service, they were questioning her ability to do the job she'd mastered better than anyone else in the company. She thought of her father, who'd flown bombers in World War II, and how he'd always told her that aviation was about more than just following procedures. It was about instinct, experience, and the ability to make split-second decisions when everything went wrong. "I appreciate the heads up," Rebecca said finally, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. "But I'm not ready to retire, David. I'm not ready to retire by a long shot." As she walked back to the briefing room, Rebecca's mind was already racing. She'd survived discrimination, budget cuts, and airline mergers. She'd flown through 9/11s when the skies were empty and terrifying. She'd landed planes in conditions that would have grounded lesser pilots. If they thought she was going to walk away quietly, they were about to learn just how wrong they could be. The young pilots in the briefing room were discussing the new automated systems, talking about artificial intelligence and computer-assisted navigation as if human judgment was becoming obsolete. Rebecca listened quietly, but inside, she was already planning her next move. They wanted to see if she could adapt to the future of aviation. She'd show them exactly what 37 years of experience could do against their precious computers. The first signs of trouble came in small, almost imperceptible ways. Rebecca noticed that her flight assignments were gradually shifting to shorter routes. The Denver to Salt Lake City run instead of the prestigious transcontinental flights she'd commanded for years. When she asked about it, Hartwell claimed it was just scheduling optimization. "We're trying to maximize efficiency," he explained during their brief encounter in the operations center. The computer assigns routes based on various factors. But Rebecca wasn't fooled. She'd been in aviation long enough to recognize a systematic squeeze when she saw one. The company was slowly pushing her toward less important routes, hoping she'd get the message and accept their early retirement offer. The real blow came during the monthly safety meeting. Rebecca sat in the back row of the conference room, watching as Hartwell presented the new training requirements for the incoming A350 fleet. The presentation was clearly designed to make the older pilots feel obsolete. The A350 represents the future of commercial aviation, Hartwell announced, clicking through slides filled with technical jargon and complex diagrams. These aircraft are essentially flying computers. Every system is digitally controlled, from the engines to the coffee makers. Pilots need to think less like traditional aviators and more like systems managers. Rebecca raised her hand. "David, what about situations where the computer systems fail? What about the kind of emergency flying that requires actual piloting skills?" Hartwell's smile was condescending. "Well, Rebecca, that's the beauty of modern aviation. These systems are so advanced and redundant that traditional stick and rudder skills are becoming less relevant. The computer handles everything." A few of the younger pilots nodded in agreement, but Rebecca caught the eye of Captain Jennifer Walsh, a woman in her early 40s who'd always respected Rebecca's mentorship. Jennifer looked uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. After the meeting, Jennifer approached Rebecca in the hallway. "Captain Torres, can I talk to you privately?" They walked to a quiet corner of the terminal, and Jennifer glanced around nervously before speaking. "I wanted you to know that there's been some talk in the cockpit lounges. Some of the younger pilots are saying that management is planning to push out all the senior captains before the A350 rollout." "What kind of talk?" "They're saying that pilots over 55 are going to be gradually reassigned to less desirable routes until they quit. They're calling it voluntary attrition. The company saves money on retirement benefits and gets to hire cheaper pilots fresh out of flight school." Rebecca felt her jaw tighten. "Do you have any proof of this?" "Nothing concrete, but Marcus Peterson was bragging yesterday about how he's being fast-tracked for a 350 certification. He said his supervisor told him that the old guard is making way for the new generation." That evening, Rebecca sat in her Denver apartment, staring out at the airport lights in the distance. For 37 years, she'd given everything to this industry. She'd missed family gatherings, holidays, and countless personal milestones to maintain her perfect safety record. She'd trained dozens of younger pilots, many of whom now seemed eager to push her aside. But Rebecca Torres had never backed down from a fight, and she wasn't about to start now. She opened her laptop and began researching federal aviation regulations, age discrimination laws, and the safety records of airlines that had rushed to replace experienced pilots with younger, cheaper alternatives. What she found made her blood run cold. 3 major airlines had suffered serious incidents in the past 2 years after implementing similar modernization programs. In each case, less experienced pilots had failed to handle emergencies that veteran aviators would have managed easily. The accidents had been quietly settled, the safety reports buried in bureaucratic language that obscured their true cause. Rebecca printed out every document, every regulation, every safety bulletin she could find. If Hartwell and his corporate bosses wanted to play hardball, she'd show them what 3 decades of experience could do when properly motivated. The next morning, she arrived at work early and requested a meeting with the chief pilot. It was time to find out exactly what was being planned for the old guard, and more importantly, it was time to start building her case. As she walked through the terminal, Rebecca noticed the younger pilots whispering among themselves, their conversations stopping when she passed. The whisper campaign was already in full swing. But what they didn't know was that Rebecca Torres had survived far worse than office politics, and she was just getting started. The meeting with Chief Pilot Robert Manning was scheduled for 2 p.m. on a Thursday, but Rebecca arrived 30 minutes early. She'd learned long ago that preparation was everything in aviation, whether you were planning a flight or planning a fight. Manning's office was a shrine to corporate efficiency, with motivational posters about synergy and optimization covering the walls. Gone were the photos of classic aircraft and veteran pilots that had once decorated the space. In their place were charts showing cost savings and efficiency metrics. "Rebecca, thanks for coming in," Manning said as she entered. He was a decent man caught between corporate pressure and his own conscience, but Rebecca could see the stress lines around his eyes. "I understand you wanted to discuss your future with the company." "I did, Bob. I've been hearing rumors about early retirement packages and route reassignments for senior pilots. I thought it was time we had an honest conversation about what's really happening here." Manning shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Well, the industry is changing rapidly. We have to adapt to stay competitive." "Bob, I've been adapting for 37 years. I've successfully transitioned to every new aircraft type, every new technology, every new regulation. My safety record is perfect. So what exactly am I supposed to be adapting to now?" Before Manning could answer, David Hartwell entered without waiting for permission. "Sorry I'm late. I thought I should sit in on this conversation." Rebecca's jaw tightened. This was clearly a coordinated ambush. "Actually, David," Manning began, "I think Rebecca and I can handle this discussion privately." "No, I think Mr. Hartwell should stay," Rebecca said firmly. "In fact, I think he should explain to both of us why experienced pilots are being systematically pushed out of the company." Hartwell's expression hardened. "Nobody is being pushed out, Captain Torres. But we do need to be realistic about the future of aviation. The A350 program requires pilots who can think digitally, who can interface seamlessly with advanced computer systems. It's not personal, it's just business." "So you're saying that 37 years of experience is less valuable than a fresh pilot who can operate a touchscreen?" "I'm saying that experience flying older aircraft isn't necessarily relevant to flying modern computer-controlled planes. The skills are different." Rebecca felt the familiar fire building in her chest. "David, let me ask you something. How many emergency landings have you made?" "I'm not a pilot, Captain Torres. How many engine failures have you handled at 35,000 feet? How many times have you had to land a plane when the computers failed? The point is that modern aircraft don't have those kinds of failures. They don't?" Rebecca interrupted, pulling out a folder she'd prepared. "Tell that to the families of the 127 people who died when Skyline Airways Flight 447 crashed last year. Tell that to the passengers of Pacific Express 891 who walked away from what should have been a fatal crash because Captain Helen Rodriguez A 58-year-old pilot with 35 years of experience knew how to fly the plane manually when all the computers failed. Hartwell's face flushed. Those are isolated incidents. There have been 9 major incidents in the past 18 months involving airlines that prioritized young, computer-trained pilots over experienced aviators. 9 incidents, David. And in every case where there was an experienced pilot in the cockpit, the plane landed safely. In every case where there wasn't, Rebecca let the implication hang in the air. Manning looked pale. Rebecca, I wasn't aware of these statistics. That's because they're being buried in corporate reports and insurance settlements. The aviation industry is quietly covering up a crisis because it's cheaper to settle lawsuits than to admit that experience matters more than cost savings. Hartwell stood up abruptly. This is exactly the kind of fear-mongering we don't need. Captain Torres, you're clearly not adapting well to the changing industry. Perhaps it would be best for everyone if you seriously considered our early retirement offer. Rebecca rose to meet his gaze. David, let me be crystal clear about something. I am not retiring. I am not stepping aside. And I am not going to let you endanger passengers' lives because you think a computer can replace human judgment. Is that a threat, Captain Torres? It's a promise. If you continue with this plan to push out experienced pilots, I will file formal complaints with the FAA, the Department of Transportation, and every aviation safety organization in the country. I will provide them with documentation of every incident, every cover-up, and every safety violation I can find. And I will make sure that when the next preventable accident happens, and it will happen, everyone knows exactly who was responsible. The room fell silent. Manning stared at his desk, clearly torn between corporate loyalty and his own conscience. Hartwell's face was red with anger. Captain Torres, Hartwell said slowly, I think you've made your position clear. But let me make mine clear as well. This company values team players, not troublemakers. I suggest you think very carefully about your next move. As Rebecca walked out of the office, she felt the weight of the challenge ahead. She'd just declared war on the corporate machine, and she knew they would fight back hard. But she also knew something they didn't. She had 37 years of experience in handling emergencies, and this was just another kind of emergency. The gloves were off now. The real battle was about to begin. Rebecca spent the next week living like an investigative journalist. Every free moment was dedicated to gathering evidence, documenting patterns, and building an unassailable case against the airline's systematic discrimination. Her apartment dining table became a command center covered with flight records, safety reports, and personnel files. The breakthrough came when she remembered Linda Chun, an old friend from her Air Force days who now worked as a senior investigator for the National Transportation Safety Board. Over coffee at a downtown Denver cafe, Linda confirmed Rebecca's worst fears. Becky, what you're seeing isn't isolated to your airline, Linda said, glancing around nervously. We've been tracking a disturbing trend across the industry. Airlines are cutting costs by replacing experienced pilots with younger, cheaper ones, but they're not adequately training them for real emergency situations. How bad is it? Worse than the public knows. We've investigated 14 incidents in the past year where pilot experience, or lack thereof, was a contributing factor. The airlines have been settling quietly to avoid publicity. Linda slid a manila envelope across the table. These are copies of preliminary reports that haven't been made public yet. Officially, I never gave these to you. That evening, Rebecca sat in her apartment reading through the reports with growing horror. The pattern was clear. Experienced pilots were being pushed out across the industry, and the replacements were failing when faced with real emergencies. The computers were supposed to prevent these situations, but when they failed, as they inevitably did, younger pilots lacked the instinctive flying skills to save their aircraft. The next morning, Rebecca received an unexpected ally. Jennifer Walsh knocked on her door at 6 a.m., looking nervous but determined. "Captain Torres, I need to tell you something. Yesterday, I overheard Hartwell on a conference call with corporate headquarters. They're planning to ground you next week." "On what grounds?" "They're going to claim you failed to meet the new computer competency requirements for the A350 program. They've scheduled you for a mandatory evaluation that's designed to be impossible to pass." Rebecca felt a chill run down her spine. "How do you know this?" "Because they tried the same thing with Captain Williams last month. He's been flying for 30 years, perfect safety record, but they failed him on the computer simulation test. He took their early retirement package rather than fight it." "What exactly is this test?" Jennifer pulled out her phone and showed Rebecca a video she'd secretly recorded. "They'd put you in a simulator with multiple computer failures, but instead of testing your ability to fly the plane manually, they test your ability to troubleshoot the computer systems. It's not about flying skills, it's about programming." Rebecca watched the video, her anger building with each second. The test was clearly designed to fail experienced pilots who had learned to fly by instinct and feel, not by reading computer error codes. "Jennifer, are you willing to testify about what you overheard?" "Yes, but I need to know that you have a real plan." "If this backfires, we could both lose our jobs." Rebecca smiled grimly. "I have a plan, and it's going to work because I have something they don't, the truth." That afternoon, Rebecca made 3 phone calls that would change everything. The first was to Margaret Patterson, a lawyer who specialized in aviation employment law. The second was to James Mitchell, an investigative journalist who had been covering airline safety issues for the Washington Post. The third was to Congressman Robert Taylor, who chaired the House Subcommittee on Aviation Safety. "Congressman Taylor," Rebecca said when she reached his office, "I'm Captain Rebecca Torres, and I have information about a systematic safety crisis in the airline industry that's being covered up by corporate interests." "What kind of crisis, Captain?" "Airlines are intentionally replacing experienced pilots with younger, cheaper ones, and passengers are dying as a result. I have documentation of 14 incidents in the past year, and I can prove that my own airline is about to ground me illegally to continue this practice." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Captain Torres, those are serious allegations. Do you have proof?" "I have more proof than you can imagine, Congressman. The question is whether you're willing to hold hearings to expose this before more people die. Send me everything you have. If it's as serious as you claim, we'll take action." As Rebecca hung up the phone, she felt the familiar calm that came before a storm. She'd spent 37 years preparing for emergencies, and now she was about to face the biggest emergency of her career. The next morning, she would walk into Hartwell's rigged evaluation with complete confidence. Not because she expected to pass their computer test, but because she knew that her failure would be the final piece of evidence needed to bring down the entire conspiracy. Sometimes, the best way to win a fight was to let your enemy think they were winning right up until the moment they realized they'd walk into a trap. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp October air that reminded Rebecca why she'd fallen in love with flying in the first place. But as she walked through the terminal toward the training center, she felt like a gladiator heading into the arena. The mandatory evaluation was scheduled for 9 a.m., and she knew it was designed to end her career. The training center buzzed with activity as younger pilots prepared for their routine proficiency checks. Rebecca noticed how they clustered around the new computer simulators, joking about how easy the tests were. Marcus Peterson was among them, his cocky smile widening when he saw her approach. "Morning, Captain Torres," he called out loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Ready for your big test?" Rebecca met his gaze steadily. I've been ready for tests like this since before you were born, Marcus. The simulator room was a marvel of modern technology, a perfect replica of an A350 cockpit, surrounded by computer screens and monitoring equipment. David Hartwell was waiting inside with two other corporate officials Rebecca didn't recognize, all of them wearing the same expression of barely concealed anticipation. Captain Torres, thank you for coming in, Hartwell said with false courtesy. This is just a routine evaluation to ensure you're prepared for the new A350 program. I'm sure you'll do fine. Rebecca took her seat in the pilot's chair, quickly scanning the unfamiliar digital displays. The traditional analog instruments she'd learned on were gone, replaced by screens full of numbers and symbols that looked more like a video game than an aircraft cockpit. The scenario is straightforward, explained one of the corporate officials. Multiple system failures during approach to landing. Your job is to diagnose the computer malfunctions and restore the automated systems to normal operation. What? If I can't restore the systems? Rebecca asked. Well, that's not really an option with modern aircraft. The computers handle everything. Rebecca almost smiled. They just revealed their fundamental misunderstanding of aviation. What if the computers fail completely? That doesn't happen with these aircraft, Captain Torres. The systems are too advanced. The test began with what seemed like a routine approach to Denver International Airport. Rebecca was handling the simulated aircraft smoothly when the first warnings began flashing on the screens. Engine temperature anomalies, hydraulic pressure drops, navigation system failures, all the classic signs of multiple system failures. But instead of focusing on flying the plane, the test required her to work through dozens of computer diagnostic procedures. Rebecca dutifully followed the prescribed protocols, even as her pilot's instincts screamed that she should be preparing for a manual landing. Captain Torres, you need to restore the automated landing system, Hartwell said, his voice tense with anticipation. The computer is waiting for you to input the correct diagnostic codes. Rebecca looked at the screens full of error messages and realized the trap they'd set. The diagnostic codes were constantly changing, requiring her to memorize hundreds of computer commands that had nothing to do with actually flying the aircraft. It was like asking a surgeon to perform an operation while simultaneously playing a video game. I'm having trouble with the diagnostic interface, Rebecca said calmly. Could you walk me through the correct procedure? I'm sorry, Captain Torres, but this is your evaluation. You need to demonstrate your ability to handle these systems independently. Rebecca continued working through the computer procedures, but she could see the inevitable outcome. The test was designed to overwhelm even experienced pilots with unnecessary complexity. She watched the simulated aircraft descend toward the runway while she struggled with computer codes that seemed to have no relationship to the actual emergency. Captain Torres, you're running out of time, one of the corporate officials announced. The aircraft needs to be stabilized for landing. I understand, Rebecca replied, her hands moving across the controls with practiced precision. But I'm still working through the diagnostic protocols you've required. The simulation ended with a hard landing that would have been perfectly acceptable in the real world, but was marked as a failure because she hadn't properly restored the automated systems. I'm sorry, Captain Torres, Hartwell said, though. His tone suggested he was anything but sorry. You failed to meet the computer competency requirements for the A350 program. Rebecca stood up slowly, her expression calm despite the storm brewing inside. David, can I ask you something? Of course. In that scenario, if this had been a real emergency, would you rather have a pilot who could land the plane safely, or a pilot who could fix the computer but crash the aircraft? Hartwell's smile faltered slightly. Captain Torres, modern aircraft don't require those kinds of manual flying skills. The computers handle everything. Really? Then why did I just demonstrate that I could land the plane manually while your computer system failed completely? You failed the evaluation, Captain Torres. That's what matters. Rebecca picked up her flight bag and headed for the door. You're right, David. That is what matters. And I think a lot of people are going to be very interested in the difference between what I just did and what your test measured. As she walked out of the training center, Rebecca felt the satisfaction of a plan coming together. She'd been recorded failing their rigged test, but she'd also demonstrated something far more important, that she could fly the plane safely when the computers failed, which was exactly what passengers needed in a real emergency. The trap had been set, but not by them. They just provided her with the evidence she needed to expose their fraud. Now it was time to spring her own trap. Rebecca's phone started ringing at 6 a.m. the next morning. Word of her failed evaluation had spread quickly through the airline, and she was being summoned to a disciplinary hearing that afternoon. But Rebecca had been expecting this call, and she was ready. Captain Torres, this is unfortunate. Chief, Pilot Manning said over the phone. Corporate is very concerned about your performance yesterday. Bob, I need to ask you something. Have you actually looked at the evaluation results? Well, I've seen the summary report, not the summary. Bob, the actual video recordings, the flight data, the technical specifications of what they were asking me to do. There was a pause. Rebecca, I'm sure the evaluation was fair and appropriate. Then you won't mind if I bring my own technical expert to the hearing this afternoon. Someone who can explain what that test actually measured. Manning's voice became uncertain. I don't think that's necessary. I think it's very necessary. In fact, I think it's going to be the most important part of the hearing. That afternoon, Rebecca walked into the conference room with Margaret Patterson, her lawyer, and Captain Frank Morrison, a retired Air Force colonel who now worked as an aviation safety consultant. The corporate team was already assembled. Hartwell, Manning, and two executives from headquarters who'd flown in specifically for the hearing. Captain Torres, began the senior executive, a thin man named Richard Stone. We're here to discuss your failure to meet the technical requirements for the A350 program. Based on yesterday's evaluation, we're recommending immediate reassignment to non-A350 routes with a significant reduction in pay and benefits. Mr. Stone, Rebecca replied calmly, before we discuss my performance, I'd like to address some concerns about the evaluation itself. Stone's expression hardened. The evaluation was conducted according to company standards. Whose standards? Interrupted Captain Morrison. Because I've reviewed the video recordings of Captain Torres's test, and I can tell you that it violates every principle of aviation safety training established by the FAA. Hartwell leaned forward aggressively. And who are you to make that judgment? I'm the former chief of safety for the United States Air Force, and I've investigated more aircraft accidents than everyone in this room combined. And what I saw yesterday wasn't a pilot evaluation. It was a computer programming test disguised as flight training. Morrison opened his laptop and projected the video of Rebecca's test onto the conference room screen. Watch this carefully. At the 12-minute mark, Captain Torres is dealing with multiple system failures. The correct response, the response that would save lives in a real emergency, is to prepare for manual landing. But your test required her to spend precious minutes working through computer diagnostic procedures that had nothing to do with flying the aircraft. The room fell silent as they watched Rebecca's steady hands on the controls, her calm voice as she managed the simulated emergency. Now watch this, Morrison continued, advancing the video. At the 18-minute mark, your computer systems have completely failed. A lesser pilot would have panicked or crashed the aircraft. Captain Torres smoothly transitions to manual control and executes a perfect approach. She saved the aircraft and everyone on board. But she failed to restore the automated systems, Hartwell protested. Because the automated systems were broken. Morrison's voice rose with indignation. In a real emergency, would you rather have a pilot who could troubleshoot a computer or a pilot who could land the plane safely when the computer failed? Stone shifted uncomfortably. The point is that modern aircraft don't have those kinds of failures, don't they? Rebecca spoke for the first time, sliding a thick folder across the table. This contains documentation of 14 major incidents in the past 18 months where computer-trained pilots failed to handle emergencies that experienced pilots would have managed easily. In every case, the pilots were so focused on trying to fix the computers that they forgot how to actually fly the plane. She opened the folder to reveal photographs from crash sites, official accident reports, and statistical analyses. Mr. Stone, would you like me to read the names of the 347 people who died because airlines like yours decided that computer programming was more important than flying skills? The corporate executives exchanged nervous glances. This was clearly not how they'd expected the hearing to go. Captain Torres, Stone said slowly, even if we accept your concerns about the evaluation process, the fact remains that you failed to meet our technical requirements. Requirements that you designed specifically to fail experienced pilots. Margaret Patterson interjected. My client has documentation proving that this evaluation was part of a systematic effort to force older pilots into early retirement. She placed a second folder on the table. Age discrimination lawsuits, Mr. Stone. 14 of them filed in the past year against airlines using similar tactics. The average settlement has been $2.3 million per pilot, plus punitive damages. The room erupted in whispered conversations among the corporate team. Rebecca watched them with the calm confidence of a pilot who just successfully navigated through a storm. I have a proposal, Rebecca said, her voice cutting through the tension. Give me the chance to demonstrate what real flying skills look like. Put me in a simulator with actual emergency scenarios, not computer programming tests. Let me show you what 37 years of experience can do when passengers' lives are at stake. Stone looked at his colleagues, then back at Rebecca. And if you fail? Rebecca smiled. Mr. Stone, I haven't failed yet. But if I do, I'll accept your early retirement package and walk away quietly. And if you succeed, then you'll admit that experience matters more than age, and you'll stop this discrimination against senior pilots. The corporate team huddled in whispered conversation for several minutes. Finally, Stone looked up. Captain Torres, you have a deal. But this time, we're going to make sure the test is ... comprehensive. Rebecca's smile widened. They thought they were setting another trap, but what they didn't realize was that they just agreed to let her prove everything she'd been saying. The real test was about to begin. Word spread through Denver International Airport like wildfire. Captain Rebecca Torres was going to face a make-or-break evaluation that would determine not just her career, but the future of experienced pilots throughout the industry. The test was scheduled for the following Friday, and every pilot in the company knew what was at stake. The night before the evaluation, Rebecca sat in her apartment looking out at the lights of the airport. She'd spent the week preparing, but not by studying computer manuals or memorizing diagnostic codes. Instead, she'd done what she'd always done before challenging flights. She'd cleared her mind and trusted in the skills that had kept her and her passengers safe for 37 years. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer Walsh. Half the pilot corps is going to be watching tomorrow. Don't let us down. Rebecca smiled and typed back, I won't. Friday morning arrived gray and cold, with the kind of weather that made flying challenging even under normal circumstances. Rebecca arrived at the training center to find a crowd gathered outside, pilots, Mechanics, flight attendants, and even some passengers who'd somehow heard about the test. Captain Torres called out Jake Williams, the baggage handler. "We're all rooting for you." Inside the training center, the atmosphere was electric. The corporate executives had flown in from headquarters, and they brought their own technical experts. The media was there too. James Mitchell from the Washington Post, along with reporters from several aviation publications. David Hardwell looked nervous as he explained the test parameters. "Captain Torres, this will be a comprehensive evaluation covering multiple emergency scenarios. You'll face situations that would challenge even our most experienced pilots." "I understand," Rebecca replied calmly. "What are the pass-fail criteria?" "You need to successfully complete all scenarios without any passenger casualties or aircraft damage." Rebecca nodded. "And the scenarios will be realistic emergency situations that could actually occur in flight?" "Absolutely. No computer programming. Tests this time. Just pure flying skills." As Rebecca strapped herself into the simulator, she felt the familiar calm that came before takeoff. The instrument panel hummed to life around her, and for a moment, she was back in her element, a pilot in command of her aircraft. "Scenario 1 begins now," announced the test administrator. Rebecca found herself in the cockpit of an A350 departing from Denver on a clear day. Everything seemed normal until the first engine failure occurred 2,000 feet, the most dangerous time for an engine to quit. The simulator shook violently as warning alarms filled the cockpit. "Engine 1 failure," Rebecca announced calmly, her hands already moving across the controls. Declaring emergency, requesting immediate return to Denver. She watched the corporate executives lean forward, expecting her to struggle with the computer systems. Instead, Rebecca smoothly reduced power on the remaining engines, adjusted the aircraft's trim, and began a carefully controlled turn back toward the airport. "Scenario 2, the administrator announced. This time, Rebecca was dealing with a complete electrical failure at night in bad weather. The cockpit went dark, except for the battery-powered emergency instruments. She could hear murmurs from the observation area as the younger pilots realized they were watching something they'd never seen before. A pilot flying by instinct and feel when all the modern technology failed. "Backup power established," Rebecca announced, switching to emergency navigation, requesting priority landing and emergency equipment standing by. She brought the aircraft down through thick clouds and rain, using techniques she'd learned decades ago when pilots had to rely on their senses rather than computers. The landing was smooth and precise. Scenario 3. Now she faced the ultimate test, a complete hydraulic failure that left her with almost no control over the aircraft. This was the kind of emergency that had killed hundreds of passengers. Over the years, the kind that separated true pilots from computer operators. Rebecca's hands moved with practiced precision as she experimented with throttle control, using the engines to steer the aircraft since the flight controls were useless. She could hear gasps from the observation area as the simulated aircraft wallowed through the sky, seemingly out of control. But Rebecca had trained for this. In her Air Force days, she'd practiced emergency procedures that most modern pilots had never even heard of. She used differential engine thrust to turn the aircraft, varying power to control altitude, and somehow managed to line up with the runway. The landing was rough but survivable. In the real world, every passenger would have walked away. Scenario 4. The final test was the most diabolical yet. A combination of failures that would challenge every skill Rebecca had developed over nearly 4 decades of flying. Multiple engine failures, electrical problems, hydraulic leaks, and severe weather, all occurring simultaneously during a critical phase of flight. Rebecca could see the corporate executives whispering among themselves, their confidence growing as they watched the cascade of failures pile up on the simulator screens. This was the impossible scenario designed to prove that even the most experienced pilot couldn't handle everything at once. But Rebecca Torres had been waiting 37 years for this moment. "Multiple emergency situations," she announced, her voice as steady as if she were ordering coffee. "Declaring Mayday. Souls on board 247. Requesting all available emergency equipment." What happened next was a masterclass in aviation that left everyone in the observation room speechless. Rebecca didn't panic, didn't become overwhelmed by the cascade of failures. Instead, she prioritized engine fire first, then electrical backup, then hydraulic systems. She flew the aircraft manually while simultaneously coordinating with air traffic control, managing the emergency systems, and preparing the cabin crew for a potential crash landing. The simulator threw everything at her: wind shear, equipment failures, even a simulated terrorist threat. But Rebecca handled each challenge with the calm competence of someone who had spent decades preparing for exactly this kind of emergency. When she finally brought the aircraft to a stop on the runway, the observation room erupted in spontaneous applause. Even some of the corporate executives were clapping, caught up in the demonstration of pure flying skill they just witnessed. Richard Stone stood up slowly, his face pale. "Captain Torres, that was extraordinary." "That was flying," Rebecca replied simply. "That's what 37 years of experience looks like when everything goes wrong." David Hartwell looked like he'd swallowed something unpleasant. "The scenarios were designed to be impossible." "Nothing is impossible if you know how to fly," Rebecca interrupted. "And that's something you can't learn from a computer manual." Captain Morrison stepped forward with a broad smile. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've just witnessed one of the finest displays of airmanship I've ever seen. In my 30 years of accident investigation, I can tell you that Captain Torres just demonstrated the exact skills that would have prevented dozens of failed crashes." The reporters were already taking notes, and Rebecca could see James Mitchell typing furiously on his phone. This story was going to make headlines, and everyone in the room knew it. "Mr. Stone," Rebecca said, turning to face the senior executive, "I believe we had an agreement. I've demonstrated that experience and skill matter more than age or computer programming ability. Now I'd like to hear your commitment to stopping the discrimination against senior pilots." Stone looked around the room at the faces staring back at him: pilots, mechanics, reporters, and passengers who had all just witnessed something remarkable. He was clearly calculating the cost of continuing the fight versus the cost of backing down. "Captain Torres," he said finally, "I think we need to have a very serious discussion about the future direction of our pilot training and evaluation programs." Rebecca smiled. "I think we do, Mr. Stone, and I think the discussion is going to be very different from the one you plan to have." As she walked out of the simulator, Rebecca was surrounded by colleagues who had been watching the demonstration. Young pilots who had previously dismissed her as outdated were now asking for her advice. Mechanics who had worked with her for years were beaming with pride. Even some of the corporate executives were looking at her with newfound respect. But the real victory wasn't in the applause or the recognition. It was in the knowledge that she had just proven something that the entire aviation industry needed to remember: that when everything goes wrong at 35,000 feet, there's no substitute for experience, skill, and the kind of calm competence that can only come from decades of facing down emergencies and bringing everyone home safely. The battle wasn't over yet, but Rebecca Torres had just won the most important fight of her career. And she had done it the same way she'd done everything else, by being a pilot. 3 weeks after the demonstration, Rebecca Torres sat in her office at Denver International Airport, reading the morning newspaper with a cup of coffee and a satisfied smile. The headline read, "Veteran Pilot Exposes Airline Discrimination Scandal, Congressional Hearings Announced." James Mitchell's investigation had exploded into a national story. The Washington Post series had detailed not just Rebecca's case, but a systematic pattern of age discrimination across the airline industry. The FAA had launched a formal investigation, and 3 major airlines were already facing federal lawsuits. Her phone rang, interrupting her reading. "Captain Torres, this is Congressman Taylor's office. The Congressman would like to thank you for your testimony yesterday and inform you that the House Subcommittee on Aviation Safety will be holding public hearings next month." "Thank you," Rebecca replied. "I'm honored to have been part of the process. The Congressman also wanted you to know that your demonstration has been viewed by aviation safety experts worldwide. He says it's already changing how airlines think about pilot training and evaluation." After hanging up, Rebecca walked to her window overlooking the runway. Below, she could see the familiar bustle of aircraft arriving and departing, but something fundamental had changed. The industry was beginning to recognize that experience mattered as much as technology, that human judgment couldn't be replaced by computer algorithms. Her door opened, and Chief Pilot Manning entered with a large envelope. "Rebecca, I have some news from corporate headquarters. Good news, I hope." Manning smiled broadly. "The best. Effective immediately, you're being promoted to Chief Training Captain for the 350 program. You'll be responsible for developing new training protocols that combine modern technology with traditional flying skills." Rebecca opened the envelope to find her new assignment orders, along with a formal letter of apology from the airline's CEO. "We recognize that our previous evaluation methods were flawed and potentially discriminatory," the letter read. "We are committed to ensuring that pilot competency is measured by actual flying ability, not by age or technological familiarity." "There's more," Manning continued. "David Hartwell has been reassigned to the accounting department. The company is implementing new policies to prevent age discrimination, and they want you to help develop them." A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Jennifer Walsh entered, beaming with excitement. "Captain Torres, I just heard the news. Congratulations on your promotion." "Thank you, Jennifer. But I couldn't have done this without your support. You took a real risk by speaking up." "It was worth it. Do you know what's happening in the training center right now? Pilots are lined up to sign up for your new program. Everyone wants to learn the kind of flying skills you demonstrated." Rebecca felt a warmth spreading through her chest. This was what she'd been fighting for, not just her own career, but the recognition that aviation safety depended on experienced pilots who could handle emergencies when the computers failed. Marcus Peterson appeared in the doorway, looking uncomfortable but determined. "Captain Torres, could I speak with you for a moment?" Jennifer and Manning exchanged glances and stepped out, leaving Rebecca alone with the young pilot who had been so eager to see her pushed out. "Captain Torres, I owe you an apology," Marcus said, his cocky demeanor completely gone. "I watched your demonstration, and I realized how much I don't know about actual flying. I've been so focused on the computer systems that I never learned the basics. Marcus, you're a good pilot with good instincts. You just need to develop the skills that complement the technology, not replace them. Would you? Would you be willing to teach me? I mean, really teach me how to fly like that?" Rebecca smiled, remembering her own early days when veteran pilots had taken the time to mentor her. "I'd be honored to, Marcus, but it's going to be hard work. Real flying skills take years to develop." "I understand. I just want to be the kind of pilot who can bring everyone home safely, no matter what goes wrong." As Marcus left, Rebecca felt the satisfaction of a mission accomplished. She'd saved her own career, but more importantly, she'd helped save an industry that had been losing its way. The next generation of pilots would learn both modern technology and traditional flying skills. making them better aviators and safer guardians of their passengers' lives. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jake Williams. "Saw you on the news again, Captain. My daughter Emma says she wants to be a pilot just like you when she grows up." Rebecca smiled and typed back, "Tell her to start studying now. The sky needs pilots who know how to fly." 6 months later, Rebecca stood in the cockpit of the newest A350 in the fleet, preparing for her first flight as chief training captain. Beside her, Marcus Peterson ran through the pre-flight checklist with the careful attention of someone who had learned to respect both technology and tradition. "Captain Torres," Marcus said, "the computer systems are all green, but I've also checked the backup instruments and manual controls." "Good. What's the weather looking like?" "Clear skies to Los Angeles, but there's a storm system moving in from the west. We might need to adjust our route." Rebecca nodded approvingly. Marcus had learned to think like a pilot, not just a computer operator. He was ready for whatever challenges they might face. As they taxied toward the runway, Rebecca reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She'd started as a young woman fighting to prove herself in a male-dominated industry, and now she was an experienced captain fighting to prove that experience itself had value. The tower cleared them for takeoff, and Rebecca felt the familiar thrill as the aircraft lifted off the runway. At 59 years old, with nearly 4 decades of flying behind her, she was still learning, still growing, still finding new ways to share her love of aviation with the next generation. They had called her too old to fly, but she had proven that age was just a number when measured against skill, experience, and the kind of calm competence that could only come from decades of bringing people safely home. As the A350 climbed into the clear Colorado sky, Rebecca Torres smiled and did what she had always done best. She flew the plane. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.